I'm happy to connect with you today here at the Church of the Good Shepherd. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. And today we are reflecting specifically on how God invites us to renew our relationship to spirituality and religion, whether it's Christianity, whether it's just a renewed outlook on how God connects with people throughout time. Today we're going to try to emulate the wise men as best we can. The Magi, those from the east, it said, who took the time and the effort to travel to a strange land, to connect with God in an entirely different way for them, allowing the Spirit of divinity to speak to them from a new place, but also a place that's existed for many millennia. Ever since the dawn of human beings, I believe God has been renewing our spirits, has been striving to connect with us in a more personable way, expressing himself, herself, to us through the images of innocence and beauty, like as Christ as a child, through our knowledge of wisdom and faith and truth. We see it in science today. We see it in our spiritualities today. An effort, at least, some effort, to connect with the universe from a place of rationality and truth, centering on compassion. So, my relationship with Scripture and religion might be similar to many of yours. It's a relationship of strain somewhat, especially in my youth, in my past. I grew up not really wanting to accept the moniker Christian, for the most part at least, not when I was with friends from school or others, partly because I felt like society had a great amount of judgment for Christians if they weren't Christian. And I think I did too, honestly. I think I personally held a sense of distance with Christianity and religion because, well, personally, I didn't believe much in God at all. And the teachings that I heard seemed somewhat hypocritical and disparate. It didn't help that I heard a lot from different faiths growing up. My father was a practicing Muslim, often also reading from the Hindu tradition, the Vedic scriptures to me for hours on end. And my mother was deeply engaged with both her Christianity and her native spiritualities. And so for me, especially when it came to the religions of the book, I felt like how could each condemn the other to hell? How could one be right and the rest be wrong? And in fact, I feel like often that centeredness or that peripheral centeredness on judgment and rejection of others often keeps us from feeling like we can engage fully in the modern age with our religions. Partly because I think we naturally understand that God speaks through many people, through many faiths throughout time. Christianity itself, of course, is rooted in many ancient traditions, picking up things from different spiritualities along the Israelite path, having similarities with faiths from that region. And of course, Christ himself is imaged in many stories about God in history. In fact, often that's what's used to somewhat discredit the idea of Christ as the Son of God, that divinity came as these other gods before him with a similar story of death and redemption. But I think instead of thinking about how these things kind of undermine each other, I think they actually speak to each other when we finally open the door on our understanding of what it means to be Christian or religious, and realize that God speaks in consistent ways throughout history. Indeed, there's kind of a modern approach to religion and spirituality that somewhat picks up on this tact. It's actually something Christ himself did, which is to look at the modern religions and say, well, the hurtful things in our practices, the history of pain and abuse that we see, isn't necessarily actually what it should mean to be Christian or religious. And indeed, the ancient scriptures in these faiths point to similar themes around compassion, around wisdom and mercy, around accepting that there's something greater. I think there's a reason why something like the 12-step program, kind of inspired by Swedenborgians, by the way, center on accepting a higher power. And they make it very explicit that your higher power doesn't necessarily have to be a very concrete idea of God that is forced onto you. Indeed, they invite their members to understand that a higher power can be many things for many people. And indeed, even if we say we have the same definition of divinity and God, of scripture even, of our symbols on the altar place and around the church or the synagogue, we each actually have our own take on it. And God, speaking to human beings, I believe, from our ancient traditions to today, invites that renewal of understanding all the time in our lives. And in fact, just wants us to accept the reality of what it means to be a human being engaging with Scripture in the current moment. It's always something new. God is a living God. And so Christ, in the same modality that we see often today of young people reinterpreting ancient Scripture, does the same on the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, he engages with these concepts seen throughout the Hebrew tradition, reminding his peers, his fellow country people, of the centeredness of Scripture, of their ancient tradition, on love and mercy for all people. Indeed, he starts off by just expressing how blessed are all the poor, the oppressed, and the poor in spirit. Essentially saying that the Lord, that God, is with all people, and emphasizing that often quoted idea, but often also not lived one, that God is present with the lowest of things, and how we treat the most oppressed around us is how we treat God. Going from there, he suddenly dives into the Ten Commandments, starting with thou shalt not murder, at least seemingly so. Because I think once we realize as we follow the Sermon on the Mount into this kind of reconceptualizing or maybe even just engaging with what it meant originally in the Hebrew text of the Ten Commandments, we start to realize that maybe even that part before about the blessings and blessedness of the poor and oppressed also engages with the Ten Commandments, so to speak. The Ten Commandments start with a couple commandments. It depends on your version and the source text. It actually changes. But each of the first 2 or 3 commandments always reflect on respecting and honoring the Lord our God. And I think in a way that's what he does before moving into murder and adultery. God expresses himself through the loving incarnation of Christ, saying, here I am, and this is what I'm about. I ask that you uplift the oppressed, that you let go of what's often expressed by the Pharisees in Scripture, at least, of that dominating nature, of the, using the details to control and hurt. We may not think of it that way, but often we use the structures in our reality and society to, unfortunately, cast a dominating presence. And we do it to ourselves as well. It's kind of like that understanding of how we reflect the society we're in. We take on a lot of the traumas and oppressiveness of the world, and then we reflect it back in our own specific way. And so realizing that that's true, coming to understand that no, we should be giving, we should look at the oppressed as blessed, I think is a renewal of our understanding of what it means to respect God. And then Jesus goes on and deepens our understanding of murder, of adultery, saying these things start at the heart. We must let go of these hurtful practices. And so, renewing our understanding of the Ten Commandments as commandments that center on the heart and compassionate wisdom. It's no, coincidence, right, that Christ's life so perfectly resembles these historical stories. Not just the fact that he's on a mountain giving the Ten Commandments anew, just like Moses was when he took the Ten Commandments from a mountain and preached them on the slopes. But also all the details of Christ's life tend to emulate the Moses story, Elijah, these thematic holidays throughout the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew faith. We see, and we talked recently in December about some of those parallels around Moses and Jesus' birth with the ruler killing the firstborn sons. We can look at the baptism of Christ as similar to the parting of the waters with Moses and the Israelites. It said that the heavens part and a dove comes down. Indeed, we also see 40 days in the wilderness, similar to Moses' own 40 days with Christ. We see 40 years in the wilderness with Moses and the Israelites. And then at the end of those, we see them both go up on a mountain and renew our understanding of God's will for us. Not for God's sake, but for our own spiritual and social health. God renews His Spirit within us if we allow Him to. Often it takes a guise that other people may not accept as being okay. That doesn't mean the unhealthy is healthy, but often we dismiss others. We're unwilling to be like the Magi coming to a strange land and saying, well, how is God speaking here? Instead, rejecting those that we don't know, those with their own healthy engagement and connection with divinity and community. That is rejecting the Spirit of Christ, so to speak. When we make it more about our pronunciation of the name of God, which books we hold as dear even if we don't read them, versus someone else. And letting go of that, I think, is often at the center of Christ's message, where He was most critical of those who misuse religion and faith. The Spirit of God speaks to us of the most ancient of truths, not forcing us to believe in someone who existed 2,000 years ago, although I think it can be helpful to engage with Christ's teachings as reality. But no, focusing on compassion, life, and love. Accepting the Spirit of Christ in our lives in a real way, in a way that really speaks to how we treat people, how we treat our fellow human beings, our family members. Indeed, often the most oppressed, in a spiritual sense, are those who come from a dominating spirit. So yes, being forgiving and merciful to those hurtful beings in our lives and around us. Engaging with rehabilitation on many levels. Maybe adopting some of the concepts of the 12-step program for our own bad habits. Maybe being willing to have a rehabilitative prison system, if we need even that. Being willing to engage in such a way as to invite renewal. Because indeed, yes, sometimes people need to be cordoned off from the typical social engagements. We have serial killers in our midst. We have those who are looking to hurt the most vulnerable among us. But often we don't spend the time after finding them to help rehabilitate them. Not only that, we don't even spend the time with those who are addicted to lesser crimes, so to speak. Just the bad habits of human beings. Drugs, those things that distract us every day. We don't spend the time to really engage with the Spirit of Christ in the lens of renewal that He often taught. I think the more we engage with the ancient texts, the more we realize that the Spirit of Christ has been with us for a long time. Maybe Christ's incarnation helped to allow for a renewal of spirit. Maybe it helped to keep the hells at bay, as Swedenborg believed, and renew the heavenly kingdom. But that message of love and compassion, just as also Swedenborg believed, started with the beginning of time. Just as it says in John, the Word was from the beginning. And so allowing that Spirit to renew our traditions, to renew our understanding of what it means to be Christian, not allowing the money changers in the marketplace, so to speak, rejecting the message of the Pharisees, so to speak, and allowing Jesus to speak and act within and through us. With that, let's just take a moment to open our hearts, our minds to the Prince of Peace. We have many names for God, male and female. Just as we are made in the image of God, God encompasses all good things, all humanity. So just allowing the way that's most healthy for us, most engaging for us to think about God, to manifest itself for a moment. God is called Ancient of Days for a reason. And we're told that God never changes. God has never been hateful or hurtful, although sometimes our symbolic stories paint God as such. They even paint God as learning from His disciples, His prophets in the Old Testament, saying, oh, you know what? That is a better decision than what I was coming up with. So opening our understanding of why the Scriptures paint God in such a way. Why God is learning and engaging with people in a way that allows them to come up with things, to find better ways of engagement. Why these same symbols repeat themselves over and over, from 40 days of flooding to 400 years of slavery, 40 days in the wilderness for Moses, Elijah, and Christ, and on and on. 7 being holy in our scriptures is often used to express God with us. In fact, almost every term in the ancient scriptures and the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and perhaps in other traditions, is often used repeatedly to point to something internal in a consistent way. It often defines these terms that way. It says, oh, this sword is of truth, and this is of patience, and this is of wisdom, and then we forget it the next time it's mentioned. And yet I think as we hold these consistent terms, these understandings that Scripture describes for us in our minds, we start to find that the Spirit of God has been speaking of compassion, of love and mercy, and the wisdom that enforces and embraces that throughout history. That our hearts, our minds, just like Scripture, find a renewed spirit, a full life when they center on compassion and mercy. That when we're centered on those key concepts, those key ideas that yes, it takes some engagement with to start to understand what they mean for us. Engagement with Scripture, engagement with our lives, to realize what it means to be loving, to be compassionate. That those engagements allow us to find peace of mind. Helping us to realize that Scripture isn't just random rambling. It's not as hollow as what I thought when I was young. It's not just kind of useless stories or even just ancient stories that tell a history. But they're living stories that were carried because they show the way back to the Ancient of Days in spirit and in life.
She has grown and you have changed. As to the bird who has flown, the wind is not the same. And to the man who has sailed, the ocean's a deeper blue. I love the love that was, but not the love I knew. And all of your life you couldn't know. And now the time is right, so let her know, so let her know. Your name on a letter waiting unopened in the mail, like the stain of a feather left overnight on a sail. One sentence that could change the boundaries of your life. That I could have a daughter, though I never had a wife. And